I call these reflections, is there a world for literature? Is there literature for a world? No other writer in this century can have experienced, as I have for over nearly 60 years of exposure to reactions to my work, and my presence as an identifiable person in the literary world course of things, treatment, critical and personal, so much marked by radical contrasts in judgments, contradictory extremes in feelings. Irreconcilable oppositions manifest themselves between reports of me from some quarters and reports of me from other quarters. There are reports of the bold, slanderous character peculiar to particular cowardly resentment, besides those originating in the general bad-temperedness that lurks in the attitudes of people of literary location to people of literary location, these being generally prone to mistrust one another in their avoidance of measurement of how much they can trust themselves, not to use the forms of literary truth to speak false. And there are expressions of solemn tribute to my work and myself. The quarters of these are far fewer than those of ill report, and they sound more of conscience's duty than of love. The reasons why I and my work have become so much a target of obsessive antagonism, or of dour disfavor, merely, where critical discretion prevails, do not inhere in anything in my or my work's nature disturbing to human peace or detrimental to the progress of literature. The attribution to me of my writings of a nuisance character, not unlikely even where conscience has some part in opinion of me and them, derives from the effect of myself as bringing into direct pertinence to all immediate personal relations the idea of there being properly good relations, and the effect of my work as bringing immediately to the human fore of the motive of animating each and every unit of literary work, besides that of producing something literarily good. Personally and intellectually, I present a moral atmosphere of presumption of good intent prevailing between others and myself in a field of human association of unrestrained extent. There is no private favoring of any particular field of association in my idea of the good as the natural objective of human intercourse, and there is no private intellectual peculiarity in my idea of the good as the desideratum appropriate to hope of what literary work as a whole should yield. I fly neither a special personal banner of idea of the human good, nor a special intellectual banner of idea of the literary good. I have no idea, indeed, of literary good as a peculiar good in itself. Literature I deem a field of trial for ways of realizing the good in the form of words, a form of the good embodying the life of thought for open recognition between one and all and all. Very different is my conception of the nature of literature from the exclusively literary conception of it, which is as a function the performance of which is its end. The literary experiment regarded as in itself the fulfillment of the potentiality of good that words possess as the words of beings of thought. Very different also from the exclusively literary conception of literature is my conception of the personal element in the relation of the individual workers in literature to other human beings. I take the quality of this relation to be identical with the naturally presumable quality of human life in the large as of the value of good, as corresponding with a common human unprejudiced expectation of an unprejudiced human comity, every local instance of this confirming a human universal of expectation. This kindness of mine to workers in literature of conceiving the implications of their dedicating themselves to the literary role in human life offends against their view of themselves as protectively contained in a pattern of human relations coincident with literature as the world of humanity abbreviated for the realization of the objectives of literature. The differences between my conception of literature and of the human status of the makers of literature, and the conception prevailing among these, I have prescribed in terms of a view in depth of contemporary literary actualities, a penetration beneath the surface of 20th century conditions of literary practice. Below the surface lie the descending levels of the history of literature's becoming divided between its nature as human concern with an ideal of active verity of verbal expression and a gradually acquired function of serving as a permanent self-varying substitute for the ideal projected in the continuous existence of literature. But the view in depth I have given of literature in its contemporary state of existence leaves the special conditions of contemporary literary practice and the phenomena of the human behavior peculiar to these, leaves the surface of contemporary literary event obscured in the total impression presented of literature's becoming arrested in a pragmatism of humanly purposeless self-preservation. Correspondingly, my description of a predisposition in the century's literary mood to resentful disaffection towards, or limitedly forbearing discomfort with, my sense of literature as an open pathway to a field of common experience, and not a field of varied personal adventure, omits the immediate worst of contemporary literary circumstance. It does not bring into clear focus the development in the late phases of 20th century literary life of violences done against the humanly indispensable decencies of human custom. These are of an order uncontainable within the bounds of literary legitimacy. But literary legitimacy itself lost all connotation of moral principle in the century's literary course, as the violences of early generation in it, acquiring respectability under the T.S. Eliot-given name of revolutionary skepticism, undermined the authority of the decencies of intellectual custom that had become identified with literary tradition. And literature itself has ceased to exist as a function of honor-doing to the implications of human existence. Nothing in the stream of recent time literary world occurrences exhibits the collapse of the moral identity of literature, of its reason of cultural being, so unmistakably as a collapse into a chaos of humanly and intellectually lawless adaptations of its function, as a certain activity course of literary world animus venting against myself. There is a ghastly fitness in these attacks upon myself, one who has dedicated her writing life to the cause of the good, as the truth promise implicit in our nature as beings of words, by participants in a modern version of literature that has degraded its nature as a working emblem of human hope to that of machinery for the manufacture of truth-ware of private design for public sale. Feudings, fierce talk strife, attack and counterattack, formal and informal, are not unfamiliar features of literary history. The violence doing that 20th century literary life has bred is of a different type. It belongs to a revolt against the civilities of literature in which there is no energy of moral combat, emotional or intellectual. It is simply a literary development that breaks with the laws of literature as a region of the cultural humane. This revolt makes literature the playground for hosts of anti-literary spirits in literary dress. Its products have all an element of purposeful criminality in them. They give expression to a will to violence doing against the literary reasonable. Indulgence of the will has extended into overt desecrations of the humanly reasonable, the humanly lawful. It is impossible to reckon at what point in time, how early in the 20th century, the idea of the personal quality of the role of maker of literature lost all definiteness of connection with the traditional conception of literature as concerned with a good of its peculiar own. Involvement in all cultural activity including even the religious, has been strongly affected by a slow but persisting trend in 19th century self-consciousness towards the attribution of a special importance, distinct from the importance of particular cultural engagement, of being a modern person. In literature in this century, more than in other regions of cultural preoccupation and activity, modernity of personal status, a quality of time ripeness in personality, replaced a conception of the good that had, in the long succession of the literary ages and their variations in human earth quarters, satisfied the moral pride of choice of the activity. The eventual disintegration of literature as a human function of moral concern, intellectual necessity, spiritual exploration, changed literature from a scene of trial of achievement in the terms of the good that its existence postulates to a scene of trial of achievement in the terms of a synthetic good of infinitely private determination. In this scene, the individual maker of literature, infatuated with the idea of behaving literarily like a modern person, enacts the Times reduction of literature to a function circumscribing achievement under the sign of its name to self-satisfaction. The personal temper of literary activity of the time is extensively one of inclination to pleasure-taking in violences of independency. As this century advanced as a literary century, the literary surface of things had less and less to do with the preoccupations and motivations that made literature the kind of concern with achievement of the good in which its identity inheres. Literary modernism lost historic connection with the moral congruity of literature with itself in its variations of time, place, and differences of kind. Sense of the coherence of literature as a tradition of activity in which fulfillment of the powers of language was linked with the idea and the ideal of fulfillment of the human state as a state of comprehensive intelligence of being sank into depths of simplifying forgetfulness. The love of literary functioning was transmuted in the consciousness of writers into a lust of having the identity as writers of modern persons. This end became secondary to the end of literature making. The violence inseparable from such a transmutation has manifested itself in the century's literary works, but wearing literature's guise, it has passed as merely modernly expectable literary violence, or not seemed to be violence at all. The stress upon being a modern person that generally marks 20th century self-consciousness of human identity is that of assumption of its comprising a right of total self-command. Those who live persuaded of having such a right make their principle of action and judgment their relationship with themselves. The violence implicit in this standard of conduct and idea realizes itself as an automatic consequence of the overthrow of faith in its varieties, in the assertion of the priority of personal intelligence over doctrinal mandate that was the genesis of the radical modernity of our time. It is a modernity of the emotions, opposed to the conservative modernity of the historical processes of correction, of presumption of knowledge come into intellectual review. The latter kind of modernity has always involved some form of violence in the overthrow of some form of faith attendant upon it, but it has not, as has the modernity of our time, eliminated the reality of the depths of endeavor underlying the labors of human understanding at every immediate time level of human life. The present time, immediate time level of human life is a surface level of indifference to the conceptions of the good, ideas of an ultimate meaning of existence, supportive of faith in human identity of being as auspiciously related to an abiding, all-pervading reality of being. Upon these conceptions, the very continuity of human existence in its self-conscious activities of self-preservation has necessarily depended. Conceptions of a necessity for the individual being of independent identity as a modern person occupy the area of vision formerly occupied by conceptions of the good, shrinking it into an area without extension into a future unexpandable with hope. This modernity of insistence on the absolute possession of the human being, of the personal self, brings the processes of human understanding to a dead stop. Human motivations, losing the force of sympathetic interaction, dissipate into personal caprices with increasing potentiality of the disappearance in behavior of borderlines between the erratic and the subversive and the criminal. Where the processes of understanding have been institutionalized into forms of activity of distinct cultural identity of their own, the coming to a dead stop manifests itself in activities simulating theorizing of the order that has acquired such designations as deconstruction and a general characterization as being reductionist. All fields of intellectual concern have been affected by this theorizing busyness, conducted as over the dead bodies of what were once live intellectual concerns. Literature has had infiltrated into it all the stupefaction of linguistic sensibility produced by the decline of 20th century intellectual vitality into vapid theoreticism. The content of literary criticism has been transmuted from intellectual exploration of the content of literature into engagement in the invention of terminological weapons for the putting and keeping of literary activity in its place as a branch of a humanistically all-embracing science of modernism. The content of literature in the 20th century immediate is preponderantly of terminological makeup, the stuff of private idiom inflated with claim of significance as personal revelation. The content of the literary world of our time as space of human occupancy is in main extent a vacancy, continually filled with and emptied of successions of rumour rampages that give that world the false appearance of a place of life. Such is the scene into which a veteran literary world malcontent lately launched a desperate project of reputation assassination of me, extending in its scale to the entire past of my personal and working life, with inclusion of a derogatory attack on the character, capacities, and pursuits of my husband, who died 14 years ago. The whole is a terroristical architecture of rampaging misrepresentation, resting on the foundations of a scholarship of quest for animus nursed against me in the rumorous void that serves as the haunt of human association of the modern literary world. The yield of this research is offered with an assurance of authoritativeness in which evidence of animus is expected to verify the accuracy of the insinuations and allegations exuded by it. The author of this project knows well the criminal code under which the literary world operates. There is no wrong but interference with literature's freedom to be and do what the modern persons who have inherited the creation of it individually choose to make it be and do. Thus, everyone is safe from punitive treatment in this domain, except those who might propose the recognition of literature as properly the domain of the cultivation of a common human wisdom under the truth supervision of the principles of language, which establish the common identity of human beings as beings of mind. Since I have conspicuously controverted the articles of faith of the religion of modern personality, that is the guiding spirit of contemporary literary life, it has been in my fate, as one having, as a writer, a literary world address, to be subjected to use as material for a veteran literary world malcontent's bid for an eventual, impossible not to achieve success in it. While I cannot but be horrified by being seized upon for an extremely ugly use, equally I cannot but regard the experience as a confirmation of what previous experience of the moral condition of the literary world had taught me. Nothing has changed except that the moral condition of the general world of human life has deteriorated to the point of making the literary world abandon much of its character of a world apart that keeps the seamier facts of its life demurely to itself. The two worlds now open into each other with the candour of a shared brazening of the disappearance in each of their separate norms of moral compunction. The violence done me, that is not only of the order of brutality peculiar to the inner life of the literary world. It has a real-life impact. It strikes upon me as the personal figure of purpose of a general human, not categorically literary scope. In its very fullness and intensity, its insane extremeness as a perpetration of a literary order of ill will, it transcends its character and intent of inner literary world pertinence. Against the actuality of its literary world origination, the assault locates itself self-contradictorily as aimed at the purpose at the heart of my work. My work's concern with the realization at human large of a good to which the literary good lies at removes of truth concern for which literature has made tentative linguistic compensation without closing the gap. There extends itself from the gross, humanly overt animosity towards me, precipitated into literary world air by this assault, the shape of a question that all who have had some awareness of the presence in my work of a direction beyond, an element supervenient to the culturally demarcated function of literature, ought to have felt presented by it to them for their formulating and answering in self-confrontation in their own minds. I have tried myself to identify, or at least to clarify, the nature of extra-literary implications of my work, while containing them within the bounds of the decorum of literary expression that pays respect to the minds of readers as their honourable and honest human own. I have not used the clubs of literary rhetoric to bludgeon readers of my work, ponderers on the ultimate reaches of sense towards which my thought travels in the various areas of it, into a state of submissive mystification. In all quarters of it, whether of early, middle, or late century date, I have provided readers with means of intellectual control of the processes of understanding they apply to it. Against no work of the era of modern writing, modern designated indulgence in stylistic liberties making for literarily abnormal difficult reading, has the charge of obscurity, very frequently brought against mine, been brought with so much injustice. It is a curious feature of the project of literary assassination I have been reviewing here that, while resorting to a petty device, not original with it, of explaining me away as a practitioner of a sort of literary witchcraft, it has concentrated so much force of live personal ill will, its animating own amalgamated with every discoverable other in itself, as to eject its subject from the stage light of literary hate melodramatics into the plain daylight of general human emotionality. What will those who know something of my work and myself, of my life as a life of thought, know it in neutral human severance from the partialities and deviosities of literary-minded understanding and judgment, find to think and say of it as having a presence in the general human world's alternatives of choice of the humanly appropriate thinkable, usefully sayable, the true. Who among them have felt such a tangibility of presence in my work, my thought, myself as present in the words, the apprehensions, in unreserved faith in the reality of human identity as sitting for and occasion of labours of truth, have felt it as holding in it for them a responsibility of testifying to its aliveness for them, their aliveness to it. This will be seen. But the time required for a determination of how much response of human loyalty the inhumane treacheries of literary world breeding to which I have been here referring may generate is unpredictable. The sensibilities of human loyalty have suffered much confusion and benumbing in the modernization of human emotionality peculiar to 20th century human life. There comes to mind to me here a view of the humanly practical rating of my work, the concerns of thought on which it is focally centered, entertained by a person of persistently loyal stand towards me. This person recently expressed a sense of the importance of my thought as a ground of convergence on which many variant conceptions of the nature of the problems of knowledge and understanding confronting 20th century minds might meet in intellectual harmony. Examining this view as sympathetically disposed to me in my trust in a principle of unity constituted of a law of reason binding thought to thought, mind to mind, by the necessity of a single universality of truth. I find it borne in upon me how generally human and intellectually approbatory attitudes held towards my work and myself, the holders having honourable claim to the designation of friends to it and to me, can leave it and myself in the limbo of the uncertainly known, understood, evaluated, the known according to the uncertain ideas of the good prevailing in the human world at large. Since such sympathy always shows itself to have its base in emotions and considerations more of the moral climate of that world than of the categorically literary world, I am tempted to wonder whether my concerns of thought might have met with better welcome if I had tried to present them in some form outside the canons of literary style, of language used in writing intended to be of the status of literature. Where would the matter of the good, the essential subject of my work, be more fittingly offered as a subject of breeding interest? Despite the pretensions of the literary world to spiritual superiority to the plain human world, by reason of refinements of purpose peculiar to its activities that give it the cultural identity of a world by itself, it has become, in its contemporary state of apartness from the other, indulgent of the morally chaotic to a degree exceeding the contemporary ordinary in this proclivity. But the laxities, the tolerances in moral discrimination in the world of the human ordinary, the mistrust of the faculties of moral judgment induced by the preachment of psychological doctrines of behavior meaning, give us no better than a human world in a state of involuntary moral confusion. It is a world without a moral will in the hold of its sense of itself as a world. It lacks the dynamics of habits of thought occupied with ideas of the good. It is not in its modernity the protective sphere of a dynamics of ill will, as is the world of literary habitudes. What are the chances of their rising from the grains of virtue idling everywhere in the world of human actuality? A growth of hope of better than this better, of its being a world whose literature resounds with its own natural spaces, within its own natural spaces. I shall return to these questions and to the case of a particular friend's hope of my work serving as a clearinghouse for some current thought on the possibility of there being a sense to make of the existence and functioning processes of the universe. My writing has linguistically a strong quality of Englishness, for I use the English language in it as mapping the world of my inhabiting in my life of thought as a speaking mind. It is, I believe, the language of all languages that maps the world of human comprehensiveness, rather than a particular human locale treated as the world-like frame of the life of thought of its speakers. Is this against the fact of the insularity of its place of formation? The fact of its history as an amalgam of words out of a number of languages of dissimilar human locales, a new framing dissolving the particular word-like frame of each of the vocabulary sources, surely argues for the new languages possessing exceptional powers of general human expressiveness, for its bordering more openly on the universal in its uniting of a spatial sense of world and a personal sense of meaning than any other language of enduring existence. As the language of the country of my birth, the geographically demarcated language spoken by Americans, it has a very much stronger character of pertinence to human and nationally insular location than the language spoken by Britons and those of close affiliation with them under the United Kingdom political identity. The character of my writing as writing in which the English language is used with appreciative sense of its efficacy for broad scope of use and fluid adaptability has not been recognized in the terms of this description of it of mine, but there have been distinct recognitions of my writing as being not just of a certain personal literary style, but as exhibiting the English language in certain styles of general employment. Such recognitions have been, usually, forms of misinterpretation of the principles of my writing practices and of the actual quality of my writing, but they represent a note-taking of the fact that my use of the English language is expansive in its range, not confined within the limits of a chosen personal writing manner. Most recently, in connection with the publication of a new edition of my collected poems, I have been credited, in a review of the book, with a unique preservation in modern times of Shakespearean modes of diction viewed as generally characteristic of the English linguistic stylistic happiest. A reviewer of a book of mine of quite some years ago, The Telling, pronounced it to be in the stylistic vein of Ruskin and Carlyle, and as such, against the contemporary modern English prose stylistic grain. Both of these judgments mistake the nature of my writing style. Its Englishness is not related to any special authorial or period version of the language's essential stylistic nature. Likewise mistaken as to my writing style was an account of it given in the 40s by the late Alan Tate in a critical report on American poets supplied by him to literary information centers abroad. He described me as an international poet who happens to write in English, with apparently laudatory intent, this remark being joined to an evaluation of me as one of the best living poets. The picturing is irrelevant to the intellectual and linguistic character of my poetic writing, and at odds with my personal history. It reflects, I believe, a difficulty found as to how to convey a sense of my writing as that of one who used the English language, and neither with a category of special American nor of special British or Anglo-American literary orientation. How to describe it other than as a vaguely utopian generalized geographical location? But there is nothing of a diffuse international orientation, literary or otherwise, in my use of the English language. I have endeavored to give it, in my writing, the identity I feel it to possess as a language prefiguring in its makeup an all-comprehending setting and context of human utterance, a language providing the contours of a world of universal belonging. My personal connections with the language are humanly and intellectually of deep implantment. I was raised in the speaking environment of it, well schooled in it, was early a busy reader in it, being naturally sensitive to the structure and functioning of language, and having a studied acquaintance with Latin and French and German, I became acutely conscious of the English language as a thinking instrument with which my mind could move with comfortable assurance, and as an instrument of expression that more allowed me control than controlled me in what I said with it. My personal nature as a woman has also had important part in the development of my identification of my life's course and work with the English language as a fully adequate equipment, answering naturally to my mind's needs. At my earliest, as a poet of American national identity who was a woman, I differed radically in my style of poems writing from American women poets of the time, who were captivated by the style and self-emphatically feminine, of which Emerson Vincent Millay was a conspicuous exponent. My writing in my poems as a woman, early and later, was of the same quality as my going about the employment of the English language and my fixing upon orientations for my work of writer. These were towards a centralizing of my personal writer position to presence in the world of my mind's discovering to my individual sense of reality as a woman. My having for my mind's language, the English language, gave my mind's world a frame of human placing in which my writer identity, my individual woman identity, my general human identity were at a coinciding centeredness to the fact of the existing of a physical universe of which the human world is an eternal, internalized rendering, if within it human beings attain to an internally real universality of being nature. Such is the import of the vision of the possible in the existence of human beings that my work has carried as its burden of united human and literary sense. About 20 years before Alan Tate supplied the account of myself as a poet that I have quoted, he, as a member of the group of poets called the Fugitives, of which I myself became a member, told me in a letter that he regarded me as the woman who could save American poetry from the Emerson Vincent Millays. This remark was of the same order of mistakenness as was his characterization of me as an international poet. Both pay tribute to a recognized seriousness in my poetic writing, and with a dismissive cursoriness peculiar to such tributes to my writing generally, without any taking of pains to define the preoccupation at the core of all my writing that makes it identifiable as serious writing. Standards of the serious in 20th century literature have lost definiteness of outline as such, from the absorption into the atmosphere of concern with literature of tenets of philosophic relativism that have thrown the general intellectual life of the century into a disorder that is valued as psychological relief from the fixities of past identification of the serious in matter for intellectual concern. The literary seriousness of our time is a form of unseriousness, solemnifying the general intellectual evasion of the time of commitment to truth as a realizable human end in programs of stylistic ambiguity held compatible with linguistic principle as itself a system of conceptual ambiguity pervading the nature of words, which denies any ultimate seriousness to language and to the mind in its treating of it as the indispensable corroborator of its operations of knowledge and understanding. Early and late, in encounters with century literary opinion and with general century intellectual disposition, my writing has gone almost entirely without perception of what it is, either by measure of literary standards or the standards of the serious or other standards associable with these as spiritually integral with them. Where my writing is dealt with in a critically courteous manner, it is sent along a track of identification in the network of haphazardly differentiated kinds of foreshortened seriousness that makes up the scene of the literary activity of our time, and is soon out of view. The track disappears as it travels beyond named stopping points, lost in the unmapped outer areas of a serious having no validity in the literary consciousness of our time, or in other special consciousness realms, or in the general world of contemporary sensibilities. The history of literature is a course of fluctuating seriousness. Likewise is the history of the world of human consciousness. Literature has been wearing a self-protective cloak of sophisticated frivolity in all its 20th century course, matching the century's sense of itself as human modernity, a costume ball of personal worlds claiming to be a world of wit, play of one against the other. The idea of literature has become that of serious engagement in an operation of honoured status in which there is nothing serious left to do except to occupy the intelligence in a manner communicable to others with pleasing results for them as for oneself. Literature's function no more than the celebration of the individual human intelligence. The idea of the participation by human beings in their placement in the universe, in a life of universal breadth of meaning, has settled into a debatable supposition, flattering to pride of mind, but of no weight of urgency. The reality of literature and the reality of human life have become artificially sustained persuasions. Belief is now reserved for intellectualized myth interest, a spiritually barren, sentimental scholarship. There is no word serious listening of mind to match my word serious speaking work of mind in the society of literary associations that constitutes itself a world, a life, apart from the scene of general human associations. And this scene, ever now composing and discomposing itself, the world of an everybody in particular and of nobody in general. A somebody or other keeps trying to read a sense into it that would make it a world that took care of itself, to give it a reasonableness anybody worrying about it could find reasonable. There is a continual convergence of such sense-making efforts upon a non-existent ground of meeting thought in this ragged scene of a world. But the ground of my thought, the sense of my work, is elsewhere. My friends hope of its providing a unifying principle of harmony to that convergence, that company of arguments upon the reasonable which jar upon one another if they touch at all. This misidentifies the capability of reconcilement lodged in the sense of my work. As it is not a work suited to the gambler's world of literary fortune, neither is it suited to the world of revised wisdoms of science, philosophy, metaphysics, the officious earnestness of which exhibits itself in opinion wars from which clouds of intellectual news float down into the atmosphere of supposititious common consideration. Here people rely on the manpower of an ultimate private indifference in each as to whether there may be or should be made to be a general sense of things, of the things of people's lives, a piece of common understanding. What indeed are those councils of warring opinions of a peacemaking sense of human existence, but gathered up armaments of thought, cast into forms of verbal manpower, the will of some to be gods of the serious, guardian temperers of the collective frivolity of the ordinary human sense of things. The literature of publicist thought takes on the identity of a practical alternative to categorically literary literature, soliciting a religious partisanship in views rather than the unsteady critical interest of a disorganized, impressionable readership. But the two literatures have it in common that each endows itself with the presumed power virtue of setting standards of sense for a sanity of world-like coherence. The literary world sense structure is a catalogue of private senses for private choices, offering a miscellaneous good, each example manned by its peculiar power of sufficiency to itself as something offered as a sufficiency for others. The sense structure of the literature of public sense, the authors having the godlike air of thinkers rather than the nervous habit of busy penmen, is a museum of monuments to the human intellect, each work of new homage doing homage to itself, God manderly. Women, too, put on the thinking cap of this official public brand of truth, take places among the images of heroic intellectual manhood as fitting recipients of public honors. The ground of my thought is no piece of public intellectual acreage, nor is it a literary residential plot on which I enact for literary world reading choices my version of the sense of being a modern person, my sense of power in being this. I think upon and from the ground that my mind opens to my knowing as the ground of a world in which to be and know oneself to be is to belong to the sense of that world. As I know my belonging to its sense belongs to me to know. Such knowledge, such belonging, is neither a private, personal condition out of which to make a dated literature, nor is it what has been called the human condition. The sense of this, a view of the being of beings themselves, who know they are, as an existing unknown and unknowing, in a void of being except for what their spying minds can steal for their putting together to outwit a condition of given senselessness. There is a difference from those literatures. The scenes of world we live in, they draw, in the sense my words of thought and writing spell out. A report of a world matching our mind's embrace of it in self-telling embrace of us. I myself differ from writers in either of the two literature genres in that I start in a state of freedom of mind from preoccupation of what will be rightly said, preconception of what to say, what to tell, that will be safe from attack as senseless. This is the state of mind characteristic of a woman's disposition to the matter of truth. The woman looks in mind naturally towards what is. The man looks in mind towards what will be from a stand of conception as to what was. In the warfare of thought among men, history is the only peacemaker. Truth is the predictable, verified by what has been verified, a piece of common sense theoretically resolved on each successive battlefield of intellectual time. With the literature of private sense publicly voiced in a private public world of its own, the literary world, a warfare of words among men declares a wordless piece of thought with itself. War and peace here, now, a monologue that authorship addresses to itself in a spirit left to readers to interpret as they choose, the reading sense they make of it as private with themselves as the speaking sense it has in the bosom of its authorship. In both the world of literature of common sense and the world of the literature of private senses for its reading public's private choices, the name and the form of woman being do not pledge a mind of woman, a looking with ready freedom of mind towards what is. The history of human thought masculinizes what is into a future of which what was predictive. The history of literature masculinizes the immediate speaking sense of minds into a truth that is but a bridge between what was and what will be, across what is passed over as evanescent flux of living time. Nothing is real in either literature or the world of it but what reflects the power of men to renew what has died of the human-sounding thought of men, the spoken senses men leave behind for other speaking by repeating minds, in more to die and more to leave behind. The names of women whose minds have become acclimatized to these worlds of history, intellectual history, literary history, their woman forms of persons being, and work of their minds, born minds of women, consolidate into an identity of neutral, human miscellaneity, which is treated as approximately male. A strained conventional courtesy is paid to the remaining traces of female status as of alien presence. The women who have found nameplace in this century's portion of intellectual history-making have used their room of predictive sense science for construing a future translatable by anticipation into a temporary truth of what is. They are like understudies seizing parts to act now, creating emergencies out of their minds' impatience with history's postponement of the whole sense of the being of us. Those of man name act their scheduled parts with the patience of minds lingering, each separate and private enjoyment of the present power of present self-belonging. Truth held at the remove of a common sense of minds generous with themselves in a future common belonging. The labouring of minds of man name and woman name, represented under the head of the intellectual literature of our time, does not rise in its sum or in any portion of it, of single or composite authorship, above the level of seriousness of activity undertaken under the perfunctory inspiration of conscience. The scene of the labouring has itself the character of a special world, emblematic of a common human unity of intellectual concerns, only in a perfunctory recognition by the actors in the scene of the entire citizenry of the human world of minds as their audience. The actors are steeped in a sense of themselves as the stuff of the time's intellectual learning. To know who make their audience and what the world hypostasized in the authority with which they play their parts is incidental to what their consciences tell them they owe themselves, which is to defend what they think against attack by what others think. Being a thinker or thinking about thinkers used to find place within certain enclosures reserved to private visitation, as little worlds of kingly walled cities. Now methodologies of thought are games of indiscriminately permitted inventability in a world of minds thinking on thinking what to think of the world, itself as a walled city, or world of doubt and disagreement, sheltered in an embattled peace with itself from prematurities of outer truth. From the world of professional intellectuality of our time, I am excluded by what I am. It is the world of a self-exhausting future. Its literature does not breathe life into it, but takes its life breath from out of it. Friends mistake my seriousness, who wistfully imagine a better welcome for my thought, my mind's work of telling the story it finds to tell from this world than from the world that answers to the identity of the world of literature proper. The one world is a world of self-deadened minds. They commit themselves to no reality but that of their thought, as having the reality that they think it. At least in the other world, the image of truth it made its heraldic own had some of the lineaments of lifelikeness. My seriousness might chance to meet with some welcome there by its aliveness in my aliveness. But aliveness can attract little better than curiosity, in which greed or envy or other antipathetic disposition can be a friendly appearance, or the full evident worst of live resentment of the alive, the punitive brutality of neighbour to neighbour as a thief of propinquity. I have at least enjoyed, in the world that plays host to speaking minds, the recognition of being there, conveyed by the challenge of neighbour stares. Why should I not suffer the persecution invited by one living the life of a speaking mind upon ground treated by her as not just a piece of private real estate, its title to literary legality vested in the residential dignity of being fenced in by neighbourhoods, the protective militancy of a self-policing world spying on itself from boundaried plot to boundaried plot of it? I have at least emerged from the ordeal alive as I entered into it. And what other environment, a special world, could I have found to try to live in as in a place set apart for the speaking of one's sense of the world of human life as possibly true, a place of trial of oneself among trials of others of themselves in speaking a true sense of human being? What other places for speaking thus, in living seriousness, could serve the need of a mind to speak what might, spoken, prove itself of a sense that listening minds heard as sense spoken of their very own? But this speaking place is, a listening place only in serious pretending, None are called upon to speak other than a sense to vie with other spoken sense, in show of power to speak with what has the appearance of sense. In the world of literary history, truth has been, in half part, the subject of a spectacle of words, executing a puppetry show for pleasure-taking in the capabilities of minds of sense-making for sense-speaking. In other half part, there, truth has been the subject of a silence of minds with themselves, in which to hope for a translation of literature's theatric sense-speaking into a language speakable from a ground upon which the being of human beings and the being of a world in which to be make one indivisible sense to speak. In our time, the silent presence in literature of the subject of truth as hope of an eventual sense-speaking of the single whole sense reality of truth has been extinguished by the conversion of literature into a falsely naturalistic sense-speaking. The theatric verbal spectacle has been humanized. Literature's makers made its subject, its humanity made humanity. I defend the world of literature somewhat as helpless against its vices, as they are vices of general human habitude fallen in upon it and made its historic own. In our 20th century time, it has expanded its inclusion of vices within the frame of its identity as a special world, a special virtue, matching and overmatching the expansions of them made in this time in the world of human history, and producing within its field of concentrated behavior manifestations, variations of abnormality upon the abnormalities of the human ordinary in behavior. It has, that is, a worst exceeding the worst of the human ordinary in that it gives its sanctuary in its repute as a world concerned with the good of its special conceiving. I have experienced the worst of its worst, but I cannot regard it as a world under the curse of vices of its special invention. I know also the feel of the worst of the human ordinary in behavior. It flees to no sanctuary. It takes the right of being what it is from the confusion of sense human beings have made of what their minds give them to make sense of. The guilt is general, and it is immense. The insults human beings inflict upon human beings begin in their disowning their minds as larger than themselves and making little minds of their very own. Thus they have ostracized the world of their reality of being from themselves and themselves from it. I conclude this reviewing of the question of worlds and literature of the sense and literature of the sense-making work of minds and the possible places of sense-speaking and what I, in my sense-speaking, have had vented against me of the humanly all-here-ness from literary world angles of location, with a summary of the elements of my writer's nature. The nature of myself as a woman gives my mind ready apprehension of the openness of mind to the universe world of human habitation. Our conscious habitation of it we have by its openness to us. My thought engrosses in it this mutuality. Thus I come to take the imparting of thought to one another in language's mutualities to be the turning of the sense of our universe world into a transparency of it and of ourselves. Is it not the world of a universe all kind, the moving principle of its existence, clear of ill will? Do not our witnessing minds meeting give the sense of its mind into it? Are not truth and the place of truth one generosity? But if my writer's nature commits me to a literature of sense-speaking of such truth, in such a place of truth, and the place of literature is a special world in which ill will has been made volubly all existable, can I speak of this problem as a problem other than my personal own? If I succeed here at least in depicting the problem as a problem of mine, I shall have at least made declaration of my sense of the human all of us as having not yet discovered a real world for literature, and of my sense of the writer all of us as being but the maker of a myth of literature prescribing the reality as unreal. This would content me for a start. This is to offer the problem as a problem I make mine for sharing. It will not disappear.